Official figures show that overall crime in England and Wales has fallen to its lowest level since 1981, and that's despite cuts to police budgets. There were falls in almost every category of crime except fraud and sexual offences reported to the police. David Cameron welcomed the latest figures, saying police forces were doing more for less. But there was a warning from the police watchdog which said any further cuts would jeopardise community policing. Our Home editor Mark Easton reports.
The Prime Minister was keen to be out in the sunshine hailing the good news of falling crime today. Figures for England and Wales at their lowest since records began in the early 80s. With police forces experiencing budget cuts, Mr Cameron concluded chief constables have proved they can do more with less.
The police and, frankly, the government get the blame when crime goes up, so I do think it's worth thanking the police and recognising the work they do when we see recorded crime and the crime survey come down.
Overall crime is down 9% in a year, down 55% since the peak in 1995. The number of crimes recorded by police also down 7% in a year and 38% lower than just a decade ago. One of the few crimes where police records show an increase is rape, 29% up in 5 years, a sign that victims are more confident about coming forward. The good news on crime comes as the Inspectorate of Constabulary says victim satisfaction is up, with police forces rising to the challenge of smaller budgets. However, they warn some forces, like Lincolnshire and Bedfordshire, will struggle to cope with further cuts. The Labour Party has warned police services may already be being hollowed out, with some rank-and-file officers echoing the concern.
We're seeing that police officers are being drafted away from neighbourhood policing to deal with the frontline response policing because there are simply fewer officers on the streets. We've seen 15,000 officers since 2010 being taken off the streets. That's the equivalent of 2 forces the size of Greater Manchester. That can't be good for policing, it can't be good for the communities we serve.
But how strong a link is there between police numbers and crime? Over the last 30 years or so, the number of full-time officer posts has risen from 110,000 to a peak of 142,000 and has since fallen to 129,000. During the same period, crime rose to a peak in 1995 and then fell by more than a half. Put the two trend lines together and there's no obvious correlation.
Could it be actually that Britain is just becoming a nicer place, a more civilised place?
Well, I would certainly hope that's the case. I think the effort that's put into education, the effort that's put into building communities, the stress we should put on knitting together and building a stronger society, all that is important.
You came to power claiming Britain was broken. It wasn't broken, was it? Actually, it was getting better.
Well, what I always said, there are parts of our society that are badly fractured and some that are even broken, and we need to mend those. And actually what's happened, if you look at the figures, philanthropic giving is up, volunteering is up, the number of social enterprises, charities, voluntary bodies is up. All those elements of the big society I've spoken about, they are strengthening.
The Prime Minister may be basking in the good news on crime today, but he also knows a great many voters simply refuse to believe the statistics. The challenge for him and for the police is to continue making savings while maintaining public confidence.
And Mark is with me now. Mark, there was plenty of evidence there in your report that crime is falling, and yet when you talk to people, many people say, well, crime's getting worse.
Most people do think crime is rising, but interesting point, they think crime is rising nationally. You ask them about their local area, and they'll often say, oh, it's not quite so bad here. In fact, things are getting a bit better. But you're right, most people do think crime is still going up. Why? Well, I think it's partly politicians. I mean, obviously, opposition politicians are always out to emphasise the bad news, and people tend not to trust government ministers that much. It's also, I think, about us and the rest of the media. I mean, I think, newspapers and broadcasters know that crime sells, particularly stories of violent crime. And I think that we have to remember, actually, crime has fallen substantially, and it's still falling. And it's really worth reminding people, that in the last, that right now, your chances of being a victim of crime are lower than they've been for at least 30 years.